Under a sky swept clean by the breath of ancient winds, the kingdom of Leone stood like a carved jewel atop the continent's spine, gleaming towers of obsidian-veined marble, silver courtyards drenched in the light of twin moons, and streets paved in spellstone that whispered underfoot. From the moment of its founding, Leone had been unlike any other realm. Its power did not lie in armies or coin, but in the scroll of continuance. A single vast sheet of living parchment that unfurled through a series of mechanical spools housed in the Hall of Memory, at the very center of the royal citadel. Upon this sacred scroll, each name ever born within the kingdom was inscribed in silver-blue ink the moment their first breath was drawn. The scroll did not simply record names, it remembered them. It linked each soul to Leone itself. Through rituals known only to the royal keepers of the script, names glowed when spoken aloud. They thrummed faintly with a person's presence. And when someone died, their name gently faded, not vanished, but turned to shadowed script, a mark of memory, not obliteration. In this way Leone never forgot. Or so the people believed. The royals were stewards of the scroll, chosen by lineage and bound by oath. Queen Armathea ruled then, as did her mothers before her, each bearing a crown that shimmered with glyphs of preservation, protection, and control. It was said the queen's voice alone could summon the ink to bend, or to break. For centuries her line kept peace, though at a price many dared not measure. At every child's birth, a representative from the Temple of Scribes would appear with a silver pen and a shard of quartz, a sliver drawn from the great crystal seated beneath the Hall of Memory itself. With the newborn's cry, the pen would stir, and the name, whether chosen by kin or fate, would inscribe itself on the scroll of continuance. It was a holy moment, a binding, a vow of remembrance. But in hushed corners of taverns and frost-bitten barrens far from the gilded capitals, some told another version of the story. They spoke of names that never made it to the scroll. Names that vanished seconds after birth. Names deliberately taken off the parchment. These stories weren't passed down in books. They were muttered through chapped lips, etched on stone walls behind market stalls, hidden in folk songs with missing verses. To be erased was worse than death. It meant your fate unraveled. Your ancestors forgot you. The land no longer saw you. No tombstone held your place. Your name was a wick snuffed before it ever held flame. Queen Armathea never acknowledged such stories. Her court dismissed them as myth. The royal keepers spoke often of scroll inspections, of purity in the ink, of total record and transparency. But not all ink leaves a mark. And some names, once vanished, are remembered not by spell or pen, but by vengeance. In the northern quarter of the capital, on a morning soaked in soft fog, a child was born beneath the sound of tolling bells. Her mother, a scholar from the lower ranks of the script houses, named her quietly between contractions, Morel. The midwives nodded. The birthing ritual commenced. A temple scribe arrived, expression unreadable beneath a veil of sheer gold. He opened the small lacquered case that contained the portable mirror scroll, a reflection of the master scroll itself. He pricked the newborn's finger. A single drop of blood, rich and bright, touched the quartz shard. Nothing happened. The pen did not stir. The shard did not hum. The scribe paused, repeated the process. Still nothing. The mother, half-conscious, whispered the name again, Morel. Desperation in every syllable. A name given with the fullness of love. But the mirror scroll remained still. The scribe stood, silent and pale. He closed the case. By midday the mother was gone, disappeared under the charge of birth treason. The infant was taken by silent guards cloaked in the silver and violet of the queen's private emissaries. The midwives were forbidden to speak. The birthing house was shuttered within the week. No record of the birth was filed. No name was written. Elsewhere, the scroll of continuance turned slowly in its vault of memory, oblivious to the scream of a child that had no name, no mark, no fate. A glitch in the holy order. A silence where sound should be. But some part of the scroll, some ancient strand in its endless winding, quivered. Not with ink. Not with light. But with possibility. There were no accidents in Leone. What was removed had to be taken. And what was taken might one day come back. In the margins of the sacred texts, the keepers sometimes found a smudge, a stray mark, a name that flickered at the edge of their vision but vanished when they turned their heads. They called it ghost script. Static from the divine. But behind locked doors, in cellars lit only by starlight leaking through carved stone, dissenters and scribes who had long questioned the scroll's perfection gathered to whisper of a different truth. There was a child, they said, who had been erased before she was ever named. A girl not on the scroll. A girl who belonged to no fate but her own. They knew not where she had gone, nor what the queen had done with her. But they watched the ink now with more care. They sang lullabies with no names. They carved letters into wood in secret. They waited. Because a name not recorded is not a name destroyed. It is a name unwritten. And the unwritten has power of its own. Somewhere beneath the stones of the palace, in a chamber long unused, the golden case containing the failed scroll test remained sealed. No one had touched it since that day. No one dared. But on its surface, invisible to most eyes, a mark had begun to appear. Not in ink. Not in blood. In carving. It was slow like erosion, but purposeful. A single line at first. Then a curve. Then another. Someone, or something, was writing from the other side. The scrolls were not the only things that remembered. Stone could remember too. So could pain. So could a child. In the gray-hillied outskirts of Alaren's northern province, where scriptwood trees grew crooked from the wind and chimneys exhaled smoke like cautious sighs, there lived a girl without a name. No one called her anything, because no name would stay. Her family, scribes of minor rank who had once copied temple records and transcribed merchant treaties, kept her presence a quiet shame beneath their roof. Not out of hatred but because of fear. She had been born on a morning thick with fog, in a home of dust-covered books and creaking stairboards. The labor was swift, the cries healthy. Her mother, a woman with thin fingers and ash-colored eyes, whispered a name in the old way, placing her lips to the child's ear. That name was meant to bind her to memory as was tradition. But when the midwife dipped her quill in sacred ink and reached to press it upon the family's lineage scroll, the parchment curled and blackened beneath her hand. The ink would not take. The scroll refused. They tried again. A second scroll, then a third. The midwife, pale and trembling, whispered prayers. She scribbled a placeholder mark, but the ink evaporated from the page. The space where the girl's name should have been was simply blank. A hollow between entries. The moment she looked away from the child, she forgot the name she had spoken. The mother wept, though no one could say if it was grief or relief. The father, once a loyal servant of the Crown's low courier bureau, left the house that night and never returned. The midwife, when questioned, could not recall whose birth she'd attended. A stillborn, I think, she murmured, dazed. But the child lived. She grew silent and watchful. Her hair was the color of old parchment soaked in moonlight. Her eyes were dark, ink dark, too dark, as though each pupil were a closed door. People who passed her on the street felt a tug at their thoughts, a pause, a shiver of forgetting. Unless they were looking directly at her, she faded from their minds like breath on glass. She never spoke in public. Not because she could not, but because no one listened. The children in the village called her ghost child when they remembered her at all. Most days they didn't. The baker once asked her mother if they'd lost a child, though he saw her enter their shop every week for bread. When the market's elder dropped coins into her palm, he looked down seconds later as if surprised they were gone. His eyes never found her face again. Even at home, her presence dulled over time. Her brothers could never quite recall whether she was in the room or not. Her bed stayed untouched for days, then suddenly slept in as if by someone who had passed through a dream. Her mother grew silent, wan, moving through the house with a quiet resignation, as though mourning something she could neither name nor forget. But the girl remembered. She remembered everything. She remembered the pen that would not move, the scroll that repelled her mark. She remembered how the midwife trembled and how her mother's mouth shaped a name she could no longer hear aloud. She remembered looking into a mirror at 5 years old and seeing no reflection. The glass had not lied. It had simply responded with indifference. At 6, she walked into the village scriptorium where her uncle worked as a low keeper. She sat beside him for hours, silent, watching him transcribe tax notices onto thick parchment. When he finally turned to her, confused by the sudden ache in his hand, she pointed to the blank sheet beside him. He handed her a quill without thinking. She tried to write. Not her name, she did not dare that, but a simple letter, a sigil she had seen 1,000 times in the sacred books. The ink clung to the quill but refused the page. The parchment hissed, slightly like breath escaping. The letter bled away as if swallowed by air. She did not cry. She simply stared at the vanishing mark, lips pressed thin, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. If she could not be recorded, she would be remembered another way. By 7, she knew how to move through the town without being seen. She learned which door hinges creaked and how to step on stone paths that didn't echo. She sat in the back of public lectures at the House of Names, listening to visiting keepers discuss fate and scrollcraft, absorbing every forbidden word like flame through dry grass. They never noticed her. At 9, she snuck into the temple archives at night, following a priest whose keys jingled like falling rain. She read by lantern light, quick, sharp glances over papyrus edges and etched clay slates. There were references to name-eaters, scroll-splitters, inkless ones. All condemned, all buried in metaphor, all brushed aside by doctrine. No entry matched her exactly. But she felt the truth breathe between the lines. She was not a curse. She was not forgotten. She was unwritten. And that meant she was still becoming. The scroll may have rejected her, but it had not erased her. How could it? You cannot erase what was never written. At 10, she stood on the northern cliff above her village, wind nodded in her hair and whispered her name, not aloud, not in voice, but into the bones of the earth beneath her. She etched it into rock with her fingertip, though no mark remained. She felt the sound of it vibrate in her throat. Felt it settle into her ribs like the first syllable of a storm. One day they would learn her name. Not because a scroll told them, but because she would carve it into the heart of everything they built to forget her. When the sun rose on the day of the Queen's decree, the sky over Ilaren was the color of dried blood, cracked at the edges, simmering with heat no wind could break. Queen Cyrelia stood in the Hall of Insight, draped in frost-colored silk, her crown heavy with sapphire in silence. Before her, the oracle knelt, her voice still trembling from the words she had dared to speak aloud. "There will come a child," she had said, "whose name the scrolls cannot hold." A hush had followed, the kind that sucked the breath from even the stained-glass saints peering down from above. The Queen did not blink. She did not rage. She simply turned her head, eyes sharp as flint, and asked the one question no one had prepared for: "Has she already been born?" The oracle, pale and shaking, nodded once. "She lives," the Queen said, and though she spoke calmly, the court felt the tremor in the floor beneath them. "Then let all that unnames her be unmade." Within the hour, riders were dispatched from the palace, bearing scrolls sealed in black wax. Each bore the sigil of the royal decree, a feather without shadow, the mark of absolute erasure. The command was clear: identify and destroy all known anomalies, all records that showed resistance to naming, all trace of what should not have been. In a stone cottage at the edge of the northern province, a family of scribes sat down to dinner. The mother, quiet-eyed and slow to speak, passed bread across the table to her youngest son. The daughter, long-limbed and soft-footed, had not been seen for an hour. No one remarked on it. Even they could barely hold her in mind for more than moments at a time. Then came the knock. 3 men in royal colors stepped through the threshold. They did not introduce themselves. They held a writ that burned at the edges, already consuming its own words. The father stood to protest. The blade met his chest before he could speak. The mother screamed, not in surprise but in recognition. She understood. They were not here for anyone they could name. They were here for the one they could not. The flames came quickly. The soldiers scattered oil through the house, onto books, into corners. When they left, the home lit up like parchment under a sunglass. The girl, who had seen them ride toward the house from the forest's edge, did not run forward. She did not cry. She turned and crept instead toward the old temple ruins where her mother once served as a novice. Beneath the temple, behind the crumbling altar and below the cracked floor where winter moss bloomed even in summer, was a hollow. She had found it once, years before, while exploring the ruins in silence. It had whispered to her then, low murmurs in a voice like leaves dragging across stone. It had felt familiar. Not safe but seen. Now, with ash stinging her nostrils and grief folded sharp and hot in her chest, she slipped into the hollow and pulled stone behind her. There she stayed for a time. She did not eat for 2 days. Water seeped through the ceiling in slow beads. She drank it off her palm. Rats passed near her and paused, not afraid but not quite curious. She curled herself into the roots that poked through the rock, like bones grown from ancient things. She wept once. Then never again. Above ground, the Queen's order widened. The royal scroll keepers, keepers of birth, death, title, property, and every detail of Ilaren's citizens, were summoned into the palace archives. They were told to gather all records bearing traces of the girl's family, the Valens, line of low scribes in the northern quarter. At first they worked with confusion, then with unease, then with terror. The scrolls burned themselves when touched. Not in flame but in absence. Whole entries disappeared. Dates faded. Ledgers curled at the corners. In one instance, a scribe attempting to preserve a record found his own hand forgetting how to write. He stared at his quill for hours, unable to recall what letters were. That scroll was sealed in iron and thrown into the well of silence. Another woman, tasked with reviewing temple rosters, went blind after reading the name of the girl's mother. No healing touched her eyes. Eventually the queen ordered a full purge. What could not be found would be hunted. What could not be killed would be buried beneath forgetting. The city murmured of dark magic, of curses, of blasphemy. But beneath the temple the girl lived. She listened to the cries of crows perched above the ruin. She watched ants trace symbols through dust. She traced them back. She remembered the smell of her father's ink, the sound of her mother's voice humming lullabies in languages never taught in schoolrooms. She said her name into the earth every morning. She said it even though no one had ever said it back. She carved it in invisible lines across the stone with her fingertip. She whispered it into her skin when sleep came, and when it left her behind, she wore it like armor. The kingdom believed it had burned her story down to embers. But names are not just ink and scroll. They are breath and blood. And hers was still burning. The path to the catacombs beneath the old scroll tower was hidden behind what had once been a fresco of the goddess of memory, her painted face now shattered, her eyes flaked away. The girl had passed it a dozen times in her silent wandering through the ruins, never seeing the outline of the door until the night she followed a trail of ash that curled like a beckoning finger. Beneath the tower, down steps slick with forgotten dust and root rot, the air grew thick with age as if the past had been packed too tightly into the stone to breathe. She descended with her fingers on the wall, feeling for the shift. The deeper she went, the more the silence changed. It was no longer absence, but the hum of something holding its breath. She knew the feeling. She had lived with it all her life. The final stair ended in a room choked with shadow. Not the kind of dark that clung at the edges of firelight, but the older kind, the kind that moved when you looked away. Shelves of melted scrolls leaned against the walls like broken bones. Some fragments still hissed softly, curling at the corners as though the fire had never quite finished its work. Faint letters blinked into view, only to vanish again like startled insects. She reached out to one. The parchment flinched. She froze. Then spoke softly, not in a name but in intent. "I remember you." The scroll flickered and a word swam to the surface. A name. Someone she did not know but who had lived once. She felt it strike something inside her chest like a flint sparking against stone. Then she saw them. They did not step from the shadows. They peeled out of them, their forms made of black ink and brittle vellum, their fingers long and stained with ancient dye. Their eyes glowed like the last embers of a long-burned scriptorium. Increase. They were the remnants of scribes whose names had been removed, whose stories had been unthreaded from the world. Not ghosts exactly, something stranger. Echoes pressed into the very weave of time, held together by the refusal to forget. They circled her slowly, curious. One reached out and ran a finger down her cheek, leaving behind a smear of ink that shimmered briefly with forgotten words. Then they bowed. Not low, not deep, but enough to mean, "We see you." They could not speak as humans did, but their presence pulsed meaning, and in her own blood she felt the translation. "You are the one the page rejected, but memory kept." They showed her things. Names carved into stone, not etched with tools, but with memory sharpened into intention. One inkWraith pressed her hand to the wall. The stone pulsed warm. She watched as symbols bloomed beneath her touch, not letters but meaning made visible. Not every surface could hold a name. Only those that had forgotten something else. Old wood, bone fragments, shattered tiles, things that once had purpose but no longer remembered it. These were the vessels. They led her to a basin of ink blacker than pitch. It smelled of burnt dust and old truths. They gestured. She understood. She dipped her fingers into the ink and the cold bit like winter in her veins. But it was not pain. It was recognition. She found a piece of old bone, a rib, perhaps, or a sliver of horn. She did not ask whose. She only knew it was hers to write upon. Her hand shook. Her breath stilled. Then slowly she began to carve. The name came from somewhere deeper than thought. Not given by a parent. Not bestowed by a priest. Not selected from any ancient list. This name had waited. Grown with her. It poured from her fingers like fire and root and truth. The bone hissed as the ink sank in. The inkWraiths moved closer. The chamber stilled. She finished the final curve. And then her name lived. It flared gold across the surface, not glowing outward but inward, as if the object remembered what it had always known but never dared to say aloud. She clutched it to her chest. The world around her spun. And for the first time in her life she felt seen, not by eyes, not even by the dead, but by the story itself. The inkWraiths began to stir then, dancing slowly in the chamber, their forms trailing script and forgotten prayers. One by one they took from their sleeves fragments of their own names and pressed them into the walls. They watched her do the same. She did not stop with just her name. She carved her mother's name next and her father's. She whispered them as she worked, breathing them back into being. The bone in her hand grew warm. She moved to the shelves, finding fragments of scrolls with names half erased, and spoke them back to completion. Each one sparked faint light in the air. Her fingers ached. Her voice cracked. But she did not stop. The catacombs remembered. The darkness began to sing. Somewhere far above, in the towers where the queen's scribes kept silent vigil, a fresh scroll cracked in its case. A blot of ink bloomed across the center. A name none of them had written. A name none of them could remember writing. But it was there. Living. Waiting. And beneath the earth she smiled, not with victory, not yet, but with knowledge. Her name would never be forgotten again. She moved like breath between pages, like dusk sliding under locked doors. Where the royal roads blazed with banners and golden sunlight, she lingered in the shadowed corners, between crumbling foundations, behind shuttered windows, beneath bridges where the moss grew too thick for history to reach. They said the nameless girl had vanished with the collapse of the scroll tower. That she had perished, like a miswritten word struck from the holy record. But even the air had begun to whisper differently now. In the outer districts of Ilaran, where the lamps flickered for lack of oil and no name-callers ever came, she found the first of them. A child barely old enough to speak, rocking in the ashes of a ruined home. His eyes locked with hers and she knew. No one had remembered him. Not his name. Not even his cry. But he was not gone. She knelt beside him, placed her fingers on the soot-covered floor, and carved something not with tools but with her will. A name not given by nobles but drawn from the weight of who he had already been. The child blinked and light returned to his face, not bright, not dramatic, but rooted. Like breath that finally found lungs. She did not stay long. The city would notice if too many shadows gathered in one place. So she moved on. In the bell tower of a broken abbey, she found an old woman painting prayers onto cracked glass with blood ink and rainwater. Her name had been stripped decades ago during a census purge, when the queen had culled the unfit. Yet she still painted, each stroke a memory she refused to release. The girl took her hand and carved the name into the stone base of the bell itself. When the wind stirred it, the sound that rang out was different, not louder, not clearer, but remembered. More followed. A weaver who had no records, but whose dreams were filled with fragments of a lullaby no one else knew. A soldier who had fought and died 3 times in different wars but whose name never returned from the battlefield. A baker who vanished from census ledgers but who left behind loaves with symbols burned into the crust that only forgotten children understood. None had been dead. Not really. They had only been erased. And like ink returned with heat, they came back into view when she carved their truths into what the kingdom had abandoned. She did not use scrolls. She used walls. Ruins. Trees struck by lightning. Dry wells. Doorways that had once been thresholds but now served as barricades. Even grave markers, weathered blank by time, she touched and rewrote, not to recall who lay beneath, but to restore that they had been. Some names she found while people slept. She learned to move through dreams, not entirely, not like the whispering inkrates, but enough to see the shapes of those who remembered themselves without knowing how. She etched names into their dreams, not with pain but with certainty. In the morning some awoke crying. Others simply stood a little taller, as if the spine of their story had been returned. She became a myth, and myths cannot be commanded. They called her the engraver, the ash-handed girl, the bone quill. Some said she was the ghost of a fallen scribe. Others whispered she was the end of the scroll's power. She never corrected them. Because it wasn't about her name anymore. It was about all the ones that had been taken. She had become the hand that remembered, the blade that carved, the whisper that found the silenced. And the movement grew. Not in banners. Not in proclamations. Not even in songs, for songs could be seized. Names etched in wind and fire and ruined stone, however, could not be undone. In the cracks between official records, she wove a tapestry of memory. And the people began to feel it. Mothers began murmuring names they had been told to forget. Lovers traced initials into each other's palms and watched them stay. Children refused the ceremonial naming rituals, saying their names had already been given, not assigned. It was not rebellion. It was reclamation. And it terrified the court. They dispatched knights to patrol the ruins, scholars to revise history, priests to sanctify only authorized names. But none of it stopped what had begun. Because the girl was not building an army. She was rebuilding the world's memory. Not with war. Not with shouts. But with etching. And the kingdom's walls, once proud and pristine, now bore names that no command could scrub away. At first it was only in sleep. The queen, wrapped in her velvet sheets, would stir with a faint sense of movement beneath her spine. A whisper like a draft, but warm, almost wet. Names. Names spoken without mouths. Scraped across the stone with a sound that didn't echo but lingered. When she awoke, the room was still. Silent. The throne sat empty across the chamber as it always did at night, beneath its great hanging veil. But then she noticed the mark. Just one, carved into the underside of her armrest. Small. Delicate. Familiar. It was the name of a maidservant who had vanished years ago. One whom she had ordered silenced for bringing rumors of the northern province's burnings. That girl had been unrecorded. Erased from the scroll. Yet here the name sat, etched into royal cedar as though it had never left. The queen called for her chamber steward. He denied carving it. So did the palace scribe, the guards, the maidens, even the dust sweepers. No one had seen anyone near the throne. By evening, 5 more names appeared. Some on the high walls of the throne room, just beneath the frescoes. One etched into the heel of her ceremonial scepter. Another found, horrifyingly, carved into the sole of the queen's own slipper. She hadn't even noticed it until she stepped onto the marble steps and blood pooled where there should have been nothing. She began to scream in her sleep. Palace healers were summoned. Dream readers. Prophets. One, a half-mad old woman whose teeth were blackened from ink drafts, said only, "Memory has claws and you forgot to lock the door." Queen Cyrilia's fury became doctrine. Every wall in the palace was stripped and repainted. Every seam inspected. The royal carpenters were summoned to burn the throne itself, but when the first torch was set to its base, the flames recoiled. Recoiled. As if the fire refused to burn what still remembered. In panic, the queen ordered her personal chambers sealed and remade. She moved into the tower annex, far from the great hall. But even there names began to appear. Carved in dreamwood bedposts. Whispered by ravens who perched too long on her windowsill. Once she found her own name, not Cyrilia the Radiant, not Cyrilia High Sovereign of Ilaran, but her birth name. The one she had cast aside when she seized the throne. It had been drawn in ash across the vanity mirror and bled backward when she touched it. Her advisors began to murmur. Not openly, not yet. But the tide of unease was rising. The engraver, they said, though none dared say it in front of her. She should have died in the fire, the queen spat one night to her steward. She was nothing. A failed breath. A footnote never even inked. But even then her own words echoed too long in the chamber. As though the air held her guilt. And the scroll. The sacred scroll of continuance. It too had changed. No matter how many royal scribes transcribed fresh copies, they would return from the vaults with new names smoldering faintly at the edges, names the queen had ordered removed. Some began appearing in languages the kingdom hadn't spoken in a generation. A few in the dialect of the first scribes. Some weren't even human names. The queen banned the scroll readings for the public. Then she banned the name-giving ceremonies altogether. The court began to unravel. That's when she set the trap. Not with brute force, but with remembrance. She commanded a festival to be held, one honoring the ancestral namings of the throne. She opened the palace to every province and let messengers carry the decree far and wide. Let the girl come, she thought. Let her walk into my halls and try to carve her curse again. But beneath the silk banners and honeyed music, a trap had been woven. She lined the palace with name wards, arcane sigils designed to alert the seers to any unsanctioned presence. Enchanted ink was poured along the archways, meant to burn the skin of any being unregistered by the scroll. Assassins, silent ones trained in the monastery of silken eyes, were stationed behind mirrors, beneath banquet tables, beneath the fountain basins. All waiting for the girl who should not exist. But she never entered through the doors. That night, as the queen toasted the crowd beneath 1,000 golden lanterns, a sound rose from beneath her feet. Scratching. Not metal. Not vermin. Something being carved. She froze. Looked down. The dais beneath her feet was woven with silks and polished tiles. But now, slowly, cracks began to thread through the stones, and into them, letters burned themselves with impossible precision. She stepped back. Too late. The floor cracked wide. And there, beneath the gilded tiles in lines of bone white against the obsidian, was a name. Not her enemy's. Her own. Carved not as sovereign, not as ruler, but as perjurer. As usurper. As the eraser of names. She screamed. Not from fear. But from knowing the girl had never left. She had only waited. Watched. Remembered. The queen no longer slept in the palace. She no longer sat the throne. And in the silence of the now empty court, names whispered from the walls. And the throne no longer bore the queen's sigil. Only a single carving. The first name ever struck from the scroll. Burned so deep into the stone that no one could unmake it. The harvest festival cloaked the capital in light, paper lanterns swaying like fire spirits in the wind, baked honey in the air, flutes and drums echoing down crowded stone streets. Laughter and music, the sounds of plenty, of forgetting. The queen had declared it a season of renewal, of new names inscribed for new children, of devotion to the scroll and the throne. The people danced, drank, and prayed without knowing what had begun to stir beneath their cobbled feet. Etcha walked through it all as if she were made of silence. She wore no crown, no cloak. Just a simple traveler's garb streaked with dust from old roads, her eyes hidden beneath a hood. But the moment she stepped past the outer gates of the capital, the city began to change. The blacksmith's hammer cracked off-beat. A songbird in a cage went silent mid-note. A street performer juggling candles dropped every flame at once. The shadows between bricks seemed to stretch just slightly, and those standing closest to Etcha turned to her, stared a heartbeat too long, and then forgot what they were looking at. Because her presence had been rewritten. Not as a name to fear, nor a girl to erase, but as an echo buried deep within the kingdom's bones. She had learned how to stitch herself into the fabric of space, without inscription. No longer did she pass unseen out of shame. Now the silence that surrounded her obeyed. She passed through the festival's heart, between the vendors, beneath the banners of gold and plum, through alleys that remembered her footprints from childhood. But they didn't curl away from her. They bent toward her. Stones cracked gently under her boots, not from pressure but memory. Etcha, the girl whose name had once slipped through the world like water, now walked with the weight of remembrance forged into every step. She moved toward the palace not as an assassin but as an answer. The gates stood wide open for the celebrations. Guarded, yes, but none noticed her passing. One looked directly at her, blinked, and turned his head as though she were fog, or a dream he'd had and forgotten the shape of. She walked beneath archways lit by braziers, past tapestries hung in praise of the queen's long reign, past statues of kings whose names she had once found in the ash-inked chambers of the ruined scroll tower. Each monument trembled slightly as she passed, as if remembering their own false histories. Inside the palace the air was colder. Not with weather but with tension. It knew her. The walls, the pillars, the stairs, each stone had witnessed erasures, each door had shut behind screams. Now they watched her walk in silence, in stillness, not as an intruder, but as one returning to reclaim what should never have been stolen. The throne room stood empty as it often did during festival speeches on the grand balcony. The queen, always eager to be seen, had left it unattended but locked, so she believed. But locks mean little to someone who carved her name into the breath of wood, into the marrow of stone. Etcha pressed her hand to the door. It sighed open. She stepped into the room. The throne stood tall in the far center, its gold detailing glinting like teeth in the dusk light, its back crowned with a sunburst of silver inlay meant to represent divine right. But even from the threshold Etcha saw the marks. They had grown. What had once been a few trembling scratches, barely noticed by those who cleaned the dais, had become roots. Deep grooves had spread across the floor in a slow, deliberate bloom, curling up the legs of the throne, embedding themselves into the spine of the seat. Names. Names of the erased. Names once cast away like dust. Some in the common tongue. Others in ancient dialects only the Inkrates remembered. A few had no letters at all, just symbols of breath and time. Etcha crossed the floor. Every step echoed louder than it should have. The high dome above trembled slightly. The stained glass quivered in its frames. She stopped before the throne. And she touched it. Her fingers landed upon the same place where her name had been etched, carved in darkness, long before the palace walls even knew what they were holding. She did not trace the letters. She did not need to. The throne shuddered. A sound like breath being inhaled for the first time in centuries filled the chamber. And then a groan. Not wood. Not stone. Memory itself yawning open like a wound. The throne remembered. Not just her, but every injustice stitched into its fibers. The girl burned in the northern temple. The boy who spoke a forbidden name and vanished the next day. The mother who bled out on marble tiles while scribes pretended her voice never rose. The lovers, the scribes, the forgotten, the erased. The throne buckled. One armrest cracked. The silver inlay wept black. Etcha stood still, her palm pressed to the throne's heart. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply spoke aloud, for the first time in the capital. My name is Etcha. It was not shouted. not grand. But the throne flinched. And every wall, every hall, every hidden room that had once tried to erase her, whispered it back. The court gathered in its usual splendor, noble robes glistening, perfumes thick in the air, gold dust flaking from the columns like sunlight caught in cobwebs. A hush had fallen over the room, not ceremonial but electric. Something had changed. The chamber, usually filled with chatter and calculated stares, now pulsed with the breathless silence of held memory, like a room where someone has just died but the body hasn't yet fallen. Queen Cyrelia sat upon her throne, spine erect, gaze locked forward, yet there was sweat curling along her neck, soaking into the edges of her collar. She tried not to twitch, tried not to cry out, tried not to show weakness. But the throne no longer answered to her. It had begun that morning. A pain between her shoulder blades, dull at first, then sharp, then hot as if a blade had been drawn through her spine. She thought it a curse, a malady, perhaps a punishment from one of the minor gods she'd failed to appease. But when she screamed and the royal healer peeled back her gown, they saw it, a name. Letters not inked, not branded, but carved into her flesh as though the throne itself had reached through her robes with invisible hands. Acha. The name she had forbidden to exist. The name she had ordered stricken from every record, every retelling, every priest's lips. The name of a girl she had hunted into dust. And now it was carving itself into her bones. As she sat before the court, something in the floor cracked. It began just beneath the dais. A small split in the marble, like a dry riverbed waiting for rain. The fissure expanded slowly, almost imperceptibly, until a second one branched from it, and then a third. Thin as hairline fractures, they webbed outward across the floor in curling, calligraphic spirals. Letters. Names. Words the court could not read at first but soon began to recognize. Acha. 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 Again and again, each line curling into another, folding through centuries of silence. The guards reached for their weapons. But then she appeared. Not with a shout, not with fire or fanfare. She simply was there. In the center of the court, where the fractures met, where the names had carved a circle into the stone. Acha. Hood lowered, eyes bare, presence undeniable. No one had seen her arrive. No footsteps had warned them. No herald had called her name, yet it was already everywhere. The nobles staggered back. Not from fear of violence, but from the weight of memory crashing back upon them like 1,000 buried truths clawing out from graves. Each one of them, every courtier, every advisor, every scribe who had ever heard a whisper of the nameless girl and chose to forget her, now remembered. They remembered the rumors in the northern provinces. They remembered the girl who could not be written. They remembered the blood-stained home near the temple. The screams in the scroll tower. The erased files. The silence they signed into law. And that remembrance tore through them like lightning. One lord fell to his knees, gripping his skull, gasping as if drowning in visions. Another clawed at his chest, crying that her eyes were in his dreams. A scribe began to sob uncontrollably, his hands twitching as if possessed, sketching Etch's name again and again on the marble with trembling chalk. The queen tried to stand. But her body would not obey. The throne had fused to her. Roots of memory, carved in defiance, had entwined around her spine. Each twist of wood, each pulse of stone beneath her seat now bore Etch's name, now drew it deeper into her marrow. And as Etcha stepped closer, never raising her hand, never uttering a curse, the queen screamed. It was not a scream of pain. It was a scream of knowing. She remembered it all too. Not just her actions, but Etcha's life. Her birth. Her erasure. Her defiance. She remembered the moment she had tried to forget. The moment she had signed the order. The moment the scroll keepers begged her to reconsider. The moment she burned their pleas and rewrote the edicts herself. The court collapsed around her. Not in flame. Not in blood. But under the unbearable weight of what they had done. Because memory had returned. Not as forgiveness. Not as vengeance. But as truth, etched, inescapable and endless. Etcha left the throne room in silence. Behind her, the court still trembled beneath the weight of remembered sin. The queen, no longer queen, not truly, had slumped against the throne, clawing at the name etched into her back like a wound she could neither heal nor hide. Every breath she took was haunted by it, and every step Etcha took away from her carried centuries of buried memory closer to the surface of the kingdom. The palace halls were wide and gilded, lined with portraits and ancestral records, but the silence moved with her like a tide. Doors opened without touch. Guards stepped aside without command. The chandeliers above flickered with ghost light. Etcha walked with purpose but not with haste. Each corridor remembered her now. Each stone whispered her name as she passed. At the heart of the castle lay the Hall of Records. It was a chamber sealed in myth and guarded by sorcery. Few had ever seen it. Fewer still had entered. The scroll of continuance hovered there, suspended above a basin of still ink, unfurling only for royal decree or divine passage. It was said to hold every name ever born in Alaran, recorded the moment a baby first drew breath and sealed until death carried them from the ledger of memory. Etcha stood at its threshold. The doors parted for her. Inside, the scroll of continuance hung in the air like a ribbon caught in windless space, its parchment glowing faintly, unfurling in a slow spiral that circled the chamber's domed walls. Thousands, millions, of names shimmered in threads of living script, each a pulse in the kingdom's long, tangled heart. But something in the scroll shivered as she entered. Something deep in its magic recoiled. Etcha walked forward, raising her hands. The scroll stilled. And then it began to unravel. Not in flame. Not in fury. But in silence. The names began to vanish. Not all. Only those stitched falsely, those that survived through violence or erased another to make space. The ink receded in waves. Gilded letters peeled backward, shedding their stolen shine. The script thinned, flickered, and then began to fade entirely from the parchment. And as they faded, other names began to rise. From Etcha. Glowing from her skin, her breath, her blood. Names long denied. Names buried. Names silenced. Names that had been carved into broken stones and dead trees and the marrow of forgotten bones. They rose from her like fireflies freed from a sealed jar. Some old, some new, some barely spoken aloud in their short lives. All of them glimmering with truth. One by one, the names wrote themselves across the empty scroll. Not in the royal script. Not in the sacred font. But in Etcha's hand. Deliberate. Wild. Alive. And then the inkwraiths came. From the shadows of the chamber, from beneath the tiles, from the cracks in the floor, from the hollows behind the shelves, they emerged. Spectral scribes with ink for blood and memory for bones. Those who had once held quills for the crown and were murdered for what they tried to preserve. Their robes flowed like parchment soaked in ash. Their fingers shimmered with the dust of erased truth. And they bowed to her. Not as a queen, but as a name returned. As they bowed, the palace windows cracked, not from force but from voice. Whispers pressed against the glass from the inside. Not screams. Not threats. Just names. Names spoken by the walls themselves. By the chairs. By the drapes. Names etched into the very light. Voices of the forgotten. Etcha turned to the scroll once more. And spoke, not in fury but in finality. I was never unwritten. You only closed your eyes. The scroll shuddered. Then it folded in on itself. The parchment twisted like silk drawn through fire, curling, glowing, pulsing with the new names until its entire form was no longer a scroll at all, but a shape made of light and breath and endless motion. It settled into the basin of ink below, and for a moment, there was only stillness. Then new script began to grow, not from quill or voice but from choice. A living scroll. One no longer bound by the royal will. Etcha stepped back. High above the Hall of Records, wind howled through the tower. A shadow streaked across the sky, the queen. Fleeing. Her name now stripped, her face forgotten, her identity nothing but fear on the wind. She would wander now, unwritten, unwanted, unknown, just as she had forced so many others to. Etcha did not follow. She turned instead to the inkwraiths who waited silently, reverently. We remember now, she said. They bowed again. The scroll pulsed behind her. The kingdom exhaled.